Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome into the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. My name is Anthony. Jeremiah is not here right now. He will be back on Tuesday. I'll be taking care of you today. So as far as fantasy football goes, we got a couple of news in the world of the NFL. So we have Marshawn Lynch. Maybe he's coming out of retirement. Maybe he's not. Adrian Peterson, where does he go? Right now we're going to start off, though, with Jason Pierre-Paul. Jason Pierre-Paul, defensive end for the New York Giants. Jason Pierre-Paul, the same guy who at one point decided to, grab the fireworks before the fireworks, were supposed to be out of your hands. Jason Pierre-Paul, also the guy that's got a 4-year, $54 million contract from the Giants, $17 million of which is guaranteed. Now, you get the situation now with the Giants where they are now the team in the NFL that's kind of on the come up a little bit, right? We had them sign Brandon Marshall, which helps out their fantasy purposes as good as they're going to be offensively. And you keep Jason Pierre-Paul. Now, the way this deal works out a little bit is kind of tricky because it's 4 years, $54 million. This deal is still a little bit new, so we're not 100% sure as far as how it breaks down. But if you take $54 million divided by 4, it gets a little bit over $13 million a year. So he's $17 million guaranteed in the contract, right? So what does that mean? Well, that probably means that the first year he's going to get his money. Second year, if he's not doing the same kind of productive stuff that he was doing the year before that, then all of a sudden they can move on from him, which totally understandable. You get how this goes. But for Jason Pierre-Paul, this is an amazing thing. Like, you think about it. The man doesn't have all of his fingers in his right hand, yet he still was able to get 7 sacks for a team that relied on him a lot, right? He got 12 and a half a couple of years before that, but he's doing this with one hand, and they rewarded him with the money. Now, will he see all the $54 million? No, because NFL players never see all of the money that they're supposed to get, right? Their contract is basically like, oh, you get 4 years, $70 million, $10 million is guaranteed, which basically means you're going to get that $10 million and maybe a little bit more if you're still being a very productive player. But for Jason Pierre-Paul, this is a cool story for him. It's kind of a redemption story a little bit because, you could make all of these jokes about, oh, he should have done this, he shouldn't have done this. Okay, that's fine, but this is also, well past all of that. So now, congratulations to him. Okay, so here's some of the deals that are starting to come out. So it says that, the Giants use a franchise tag on Pierre-Paul for 1 year, $17 million basically. Okay, so maybe it's not saying the full weight of what he's actually doing. Okay, so it's still not saying how it breaks down, but basically, yeah. So you can assume it's probably around $13 million for the first, year, and then after that, they're kind of going to reevaluate it after that. But for Jason Pierre-Paul, how does this, impact his fantasy football perspective? Well, you look at the Giants as a whole, right? And I said Jason Pierre-Paul himself got 7 sacks, which, like I said, really good. That's something that you didn't exactly expect from him. You didn't know what to expect from him because the year before that he had 1 sack. You didn't know if he was going to basically get 2 sacks or 10 sacks. You didn't know necessarily how to look at this going forward. But now you look at the team from a defensive standpoint, right? Just kind of look at the sack perspective. You got Olivier Vernon, who came over from the Dolphins. He had a good year with 8.5 sacks. You got Landon Collins on that defense. You have a couple of people on there, even like a Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie. You have some people, Eli Apple, who's a young player on the team, people who are starting to slowly gel a little bit more and more as the year went along, and you brought in Brandon Marshall for offense, and you still have a good team on defense. You have the situation right now where they're building that team, and there's no real guarantee that the Giants are not going to be the number one team in that division, right? Because as good as the Cowboys were last year at 14-2, they were 4-12 the year before that. So this could be a situation where the Giants make that leap, and all of a sudden they overtake teams in the NFC East, right? Because why not? Like, are you telling me that the Cowboys, after losing their offensive lineman to retirement, and after losing Carr to free agency, after he signs with the Baltimore Ravens, after they lose all these players, they're all of a sudden going to be the same team? I don't think so. The Giants are a good team. The Redskins, they are a team that has a good quarterback, but you don't know what else is with the team because they lost Pierre Garçon, and they also lost Deshaun Jackson. Yeah, they brought in Terrell Pryor, but that doesn't mean he's going to make up for what they lost. And the Eagles, they have a rookie quarterback. So the Giants could easily be on the way to being a good team. And you mix in the fact that last year, as far as rushing yards against, they were tied for third with the Patriots, right, in 1,417 yards giving up rushing. They were a good team against the run. Against the pass, they were fine. They weren't anything special. They were basically 4,000 yards given up on the season. They need a little bit of help as far as that goes, but now solidifying Jason Pierre-Paul, you at least have something to go forward with that defense, and it helps them out going forward. Depending on if you're in a fantasy league where you have the independent defensive player, Jason Pierre-Paul, is he J.J. Watt? No. Is he even Jadeveon Clowney? No. Is he Luke Kuechly? No. But him being on that team helps out your defense as a whole because he is someone that gives stability to that defensive line. He makes everything kind of go with them because he's going to be the main guys that they have to focus on. Having him re-sign helps out a lot going forward for the Giants. Now, there's one other question as far as this goes and relates for the Giants, which is now that you have Jason Pierre-Paul kind of signed long-term and everything's looking good as far as that goes, now you got to wonder with the rest of the defense, right? Because with the rest of the defense, like I said, you have Olivier Vernon on that defense. You have Eli Apple on that defense. You have people on the defense that, they're not what they were back in 2007 or 2011 where they had a fantastic defense. But they're slowly, every now and then building that up a little bit. Olivier Vernon, 26 years old, he is going to be somebody who you can trust and rely on. He's going to get you probably around 8 to 10 sacks a season. Jason Pierre-Paul, probably somewhere around 7 to 10 again, right? He's probably going to have the same production, if not a little bit better, getting a little bit more accustomed to playing with a mangled hand, right? At this point, he's had it for a little over a year. He's probably more or less understanding how to play NFL football with it, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but it seems like he kind of was able to get that going. The one problem that they had last year was, like I said, in the passing game. They were not good as far as a defensive whole in the passing game. Eli Apple took some steps, and he did some good things. But you look at it as a whole, they were in the 20s as far as that goes, as far as passing defense goes, right? Specifically, they were 23rd. Now, you're barely beating out teams like Oakland, Washington, Dallas, Indianapolis. I understand you can pass a lot in the NFL, but you need to have a good passing defense, considering, like I said, you have a really good quarterback in your division in Kirk Cousins. You have a Hall of Fame probably quarterback in Eli Manning, and you have a rookie in there who started to show some good things last year. They need to get that thing fixed up, but if they can get that fixed up, that's really good going forward for them. When we get back from the break, we're going to stay in the NFL as far as free agency goes. We're going to talk about the whole Latavius Murray, Adrian Peterson, Marshawn Lynch, kind of how everything works out there with Minnesota, Oakland, and what the possibilities could be with them going forward. When we get back from Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. Okay, so now we're going to stay in the NFL. We're going to go to a little bit different area. Instead of defense, we're going to go offense. So there's kind of a weird situation going on now with Oakland. Forget about the fact that you don't even know if the Oakland Raiders are going to stay in Oakland or if they're going to go to Las Vegas. You have the running back situation in flux right now because last year you had a three-headed monster in Latavius Murray, you had Washington, you had Richard, you had people on that team that you could rely on to get a decent amount of yards every single game. It never was exactly consistent of like, oh, okay, this is going to be the number one back, this is going to be the number two back, because depending on the week, anyone could have stepped up. But now, Murray, he's gone, right? He went to the Minnesota Vikings on a 3-year, $15 million contract. Now you have Richard still on there, and you also have Washington, but they're not going to be the number one backs probably. And the reason why I say that is because you still have these rumors coming out there about Adrian Peterson, about Marshawn Lynch even. Right, Marshawn Lynch. Yeah. The guy that didn't play last year, that retired from the Seattle Seahawks, all that situation, the Raiders are interested in him, which is kind of weird because the Seahawks still hold his rights. You know, he's still under contract with them, but the Raiders want him. And for the life of me, I can't understand why Marshawn Lynch would do that. One possible scenario you could say is, well, he's from Oakland. You know, he went to Cal. He was right in the, you know, medical truck, you know, back when he was in college. This could be like a homecoming for him. Right, but the team might not even be in Oakland. It may be in Las Vegas. So what does that do for you there? And also, does Marshawn Lynch really, like, throw you as a guy that's going to basically be peer pressure to come back or that cares at all about the money you're going to throw at him to make him come back? If Marshawn Lynch says he's done, he's probably done. Now, let's just hypothetically say these things, right? Because all this fantasy football podcast is doing is basically saying, okay, so we take player X, and if we put him in situation Y, what's the production he's going to have in the season later on, right? Okay, so you have the three running backs like I talked about, right? You have Latavius Murray, who at one point was a really good running back for the Raiders, but last year not so much. Now he had 12 rushing touchdowns, which was nice, but he only had 788 yards rushing. Like I said, he kind of split time with Richard and Washington. So he got a lot of touchdowns, but his yards and production wasn't the same kind of thing because you had him who had all of that spotlight on him the year before that because he got 1,000 yards, and maybe you thought, oh, this can be the guy because you had Derek Carr stepping up, you had Amari Cooper stepping up. Maybe this was going to be like the three-headed monster where, okay, you got these three guys and we're good. Last year, not so much, goes to Minnesota. So what happens if you take him out and you put in Adrian Peterson? Okay, well, Adrian Peterson didn't have a good year last year, right? He had the worst year of his career. He was injured a lot. Okay, with Marshawn Lynch, he didn't play at all last year, and the year before that when he played, he basically didn't do anything to help him out, right? He was an okay player, but by no means was he somebody that was anywhere close to beast mode, right? He didn't have 1,000 yards. He didn't have 500 yards. He didn't have a good year at all. And then he decided to retire, which makes sense. So I don't really understand why this is the story with the Raiders for Marshawn Lynch. I get why it is for Peterson, but for Marshawn Lynch, he had 417 yards 2 years ago. Forget about the fact that he probably doesn't want to come out of retirement, and forget about the fact that he's 30 years old. He's going to be 31 in April. Forget about all those facts. The man stayed out of football for a year, and now you're going to have a running back who his job was basically to run at people, not run around people, not try and juke people, run through people. You're going to have him come back after a year off? Like, I don't see how that helps in fantasy football or in football, either one, at all, right? Because if you bring him back, that's not going to make the Raiders that much better, right? If you're going to do that, either rely on the young guys and hope they can step up or draft one of the running backs that's coming out of the draft, like a Christian McCaffrey, a Dalvin Cook, a Leonard Fournette, someone like that. I don't understand this move that much as far as Marshawn Lynch goes. I don't understand this move that much for the Raiders. Like, are you just trying to go after names? Do you really not trust the people that much that you have? Do you not trust Richard? Do you not trust Washington? Do you just basically hope that they, you know, can be a good number two back and you can just kind of ride this through? I don't understand it that much. Now, I think he could be a good player in spurts, but if you bring in Marshawn Lynch, he's going to be the number one guy. If you bring in Adrian Peterson, he's going to be the number one guy, and I love Adrian Peterson. He is my favorite running back of the last 15 years. I don't think he's that guy anymore, man. And if you put him on a team and have him be the number one guy, like, what makes you think he can still be that guy, right? Because you can say, like, oh, well, 2 years ago he led the league in rushing. Cool. Last year he got hurt. And you could say, like, oh, yeah, well, his injury. Okay, when you get older, the injuries pile up, right? All of a sudden, now the hamstring hurts a little bit more. Now the hip hurts a little bit more. Now the knee hurts a little bit more. Now the back hurts a little bit more. These things happen, right? You can say, oh, the reason he wasn't good was because of injuries. Well, injuries come with age. And both of these guys are 30, 31 years old, and I don't see them basically being any kind of productive. I understand what they were in the past. I understand they were a great running back before. The Miami Dolphins brought in Arian Foster, and he didn't do anything for them, right? He had one game where he had a pretty good day, but that was basically it for him. And what they did was they relied on Jay Ajayi. And Jay Ajayi had a few games where he had over 200 yards and had really productive season, made the Pro Bowl, everything's great. Now he's probably going to get his money in about a year or so once he basically proves he can do it again. I don't understand why you're doing this with Marshawn Lynch or Adrian Peterson, and I love Adrian Peterson, and I hope he does well. But at this point, I think you'd rather just stick with the people that you have on your roster, right? Like, if you believe that much in Richard or Washington, stay with them, right? Stay with them and try and build that way, right? See if you can, make these guys into a better player, because I don't think anybody of us saw Marshawn Lynch basically, or not Marshawn Lynch, Jay Ajayi being what he was. I don't think anybody really saw that he was going to be a guy that, had 200-yard rushing games multiple times. I don't think we saw that. And for someone like a DeAndre Washington, he had 467 yards, which isn't going to light the world on fire any stretch like that. But he had a few good games, right? He had 99 yards in the second week of the season, and he had other games where he would do some rushing and receiving, by the way. Getting you both of those productions will help out, especially in fantasy football. And then even someone like a Jalen Richard, right? He, at 491, combined, they had almost 1,000 yards rushing, which, again, you want to have that for one running back. But if you can have that good enough of a production from both of them, maybe try and push one of them a little bit more. Couldn't hurt, and if you get a good production from them, now all of a sudden you have something where you can build on. Also, the Raiders' offensive line is really good. It's up there with the Cowboys. It may not be the Cowboys' offensive line, but it's still up there as far as a really good offensive line. And when you have a really good offensive line, you don't need the best running back in the game. You just need somebody that can do a lot for you, because while you do have Ezekiel Elliott out in Dallas, you don't really need to have a fantastic running game. You just have to have a good running game. Talked about before with LeGarrette Blount in New England, he barely had over 1,000 yards. What he did was have a lot of touchdowns. You got to have these little dink and dunk passes that, people that can catch the ball out of the backfield, and that's what both Richard and Washington can do. They can get you some yards coming out of the backfield with those little, dump off screen passes. That's what you need more than anything else. Yeah, if you can have 1,200 yard running back, great, fantastic. But if you can get around 1,000 yards and get any kind of 300-400 yards receiving from them, that's all you need. And I think if you lean on that with the Raiders, I think that has the potential to happen. With that being said, we're going to take a break. We're going to come back. There's a couple more things for fantasy football perspective we're going to talk about in the world of the NFL. Talk about Richard Sherman. It looks like he might be a free agent. I say might because it's one of those things where they're saying, oh, he's available for the right price. Whatever that means, right? That could mean a lot of different things. That could mean, I want 10 first-round picks. Okay, we're not giving you 10 first-round picks. Well, then you don't get him. Okay, then he wasn't really available. But with that being said, we're going to take it to another break. We come back, we'll talk about Richard Sherman and a few other things around the NFL and the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And welcome back to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. Okay, so we have the situation right now with Richard Sherman where he's available, kind of, at the right price, right? That's kind of how this whole situation goes. Oh, you can have him, but if it's at the right price, which makes no real sense. It's just kind of you throwing something out there just to throw it out there to see if it sticks, right? Basically want to see if anybody's going to get the first round or 2 first-round picks for Richard Sherman, which they might, who knows. He's 28 years old. It's not like he's an old player. He's still kind of in his prime, still a top 5 wide receiver, still a top 5 cornerback in the NFL. So who knows? Maybe teams give up a decent amount for him. But the thing that seems kind of strange with the whole Richard Sherman thing is the slow bleeding of the Seahawks defense, right? More specifically, their secondary, right? Because think about when they were the Legion of Boom, right? The Legion of Boom, when it started, you had, I don't know if Maxwell was one of the original players, but you had Brandon Browner, you had Richard Sherman, you had Cam Chancellor, you had Earl Thomas, right? And the 4 of them were really good together, right? They had an amazing defense that led them to a Super Bowl win where they just demolished the Denver Broncos. And then after that, they lost by a yard to the Patriots, right? They basically had the thing where they should have had Marshawn Lynch run from the 1-yard line, but they passed. Malcolm Butler intercepted, touchdown or interception, Patriots, they win, everything else like that. You understand how that goes. Then they let Brandon Browner go. Then they let Byron Maxwell go. And then you were basically left with Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, and Cam Chancellor, who were both, all of them really good players, right? All of them very talented. You saw what happened last year when Earl Thomas went out. That defense, not the same. Cam Chancellor's still great. Richard Sherman's still great. But you needed Earl Thomas there as well to basically make everything run smoothly. So why do I bring up all these players, right? Why do I talk about the slow bleeding and everything else like that? Because we've seen in, any sport you want to talk about, if you talk to fans of the Warriors this year in basketball, they're going to talk about the depth of their team compared to what it was last year, and maybe that's the reason why they're not winning as much now. Yes, Kevin Durant going down doesn't help, but you still have the same 3 core players you had last year in Draymond Green, Steph Curry, and Klay Thompson doing stuff for them. You also have a situation where you have like a baseball team where once you lose your main player, then all of a sudden you have to rely more on other players and maybe they're not as good. The best thing to have is depth, right? For the Seahawks, you're slowly draining away that team, right? You're slowly draining away everything they had on that team, and the people they have on defense to basically sub in for them, they're not the same, right? And from a fantasy football perspective with this whole thing, 3-4 years ago, if you had the Seattle defense, you felt good. You're like, yeah, I got this. They're going to be great. This is going to be something where I don't have to even look at this for the rest of the year. They're going to get me all these points. Everything's going to be great. They're going to get interceptions. They're going to get sacks. Everything is going to be great. If they get rid of Richard Sherman, forget where he goes. Now, if he goes to some team like the Patriots, get out of here. Go home. How does that happen? But forget about where he goes. If he goes to the Jaguars, if he goes to the Jets, if he goes to the Bengals, wherever he goes, right? That all of a sudden now you're relying really on Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas to be the guys and basically take on more of a responsibility. It's one thing if you're going to split it 4 different ways. Fine. It's one thing if you're going to split it 3 different ways. Fine. When Earl Thomas went down, then you basically split it 2 different ways with the other players who hopefully they could kind of get better, adjust, and become better players, and that never ended up happening. For the Seattle defense last year, were they terrible? No. But like I said, that takes into account a little bit of the fact that they had Earl Thomas, right? They were 8th in passing defense last year, and even in the running defense, right? We say like, okay, they're 7th in the NFL in rushing defense. They're still good, but now if you get rid of Richard Sherman, it's just slowly making the team a little bit less and less and less and less. You know, and you have these quotes coming out from Doug Baldwin that says the sense of urgency kind of wavered into the realm of frustration when he talked about Richard Sherman, when Doug Baldwin talked about Richard Sherman. We were frustrated that we weren't as successful as we know we can be. We weren't dominating games. We weren't consistent offensively. Honestly, I was frustrated through the course of the year. You know, they won the NFC West, but they didn't advance past the divisional round for the second straight year. Baldwin had a good year, but when Earl Thomas went out, it wasn't the same thing. Speaking specifically about Richard Sherman, he says, I say that Sherman's greatest asset can be his greatest weakness. He's very smart, and sometimes he thinks he's smarter than he is, and I have no issue Squam saying that because I'll say that to his face. I love him to death because at times he's very consistent, very considerate, and very thoughtful, but other times he's just has his pride get in the way. But that pride is the same thing that propelled him to be the greatest corner in our game today. So he kind of hit on what I was talking about as well, right? Talking about, you know, they didn't live up to expectations that they thought they would last year. Earl Thomas being out didn't help. Richard Sherman, you know, all he's basically saying is that, you know, he's a little bit too cocky, a little bit too full of himself, but that same confidence gets to the NFL, which, by the way, I don't think you can meet any NFL player that isn't cocky. None of them. No player that's not cocky, because you understand how many different obstacles you have to overcome, many, you know, things you have to do in your life just to get to the NFL. It's not like, oh, I got talent, bam, NFL. No, that's not how this goes. Like, you have to try really hard, go through a lot of different obstacles, go through so many different versions of hell just to get to that place. And with the Seattle defense, they might be able to get back to what they were. They may be able to adjust and get some of the players, but I just keep seeing all these people leave, and I can't think that this is going to be anything that helps the team out, right? Like, yeah, fine. If you get like a first-round pick for Richard Sherman, that's great, but what's to say that first-round pick is going to be as good as Richard Sherman or is going to mesh as well? Because, like I said, this team's been going around for, what, like 4 or 5 years, the Seattle defense? Like, how much longer do they have as, like, a core defense with Earl Thomas and Cam Chancellor until they start to erode a little bit, too? Like, you have these players that play really well together and know what to do together, and it's going to be a transition no matter what if you bring in other guys. But if you bring in too many other guys, then all of a sudden you run the risk of just this whole situation being really weird and out of whack and people not knowing what to do, and all of a sudden you start getting people pointing at one another. And this is also a Seattle team that basically doesn't mind kind of sticking their face into a furnace with, be it political issues, be it racial issues, be it whatever. Like, they'll talk about what they want to talk about. You are not going to silence Michael Bennett. You're not going to silence Richard Sherman either. But with the Seattle Seahawks going forward, the one positive that they have, that division kind of stinks, right? Like, they can be an okay defense, but the division stinks. Like, the Niners, bad. The Rams, bad. The Cardinals, they were good the year before that, but last year they kind of hit a bit of a skid, not the same kind of a team. So you assume the Seahawks are going to win the division again, but like I said previously, their goal isn't to make the playoffs. Their goal is to go past the divisional round, to go to the NFC Championship game or the Super Bowl. That's what they want to do. They want to be a team that can win another Super Bowl to make up for the one that they lost. They want to be a team that's thought of as one of the best defensive, historically great teams in the history of the NFL. They're kind of close to that level right now because the Legion of Boom is such an iconic kind of nickname that you're going to remember that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a team for all time that you're going to remember going forward. If they get another Super Bowl and they win 2 out of, in the last, 4 or 5 years, then all of a sudden you start to get to that point. But if you keep draining these players from there, I don't think that's going to be the case. Like I said, Michael Bennett's still good. Cam Chancellor's still good. Earl Thomas is still good. All of them are still good players. Just stop eroding the team so much. I understand everybody has a price and everything in life is a negotiation, but at the same time, just kind of pump the brakes a little bit. Richard Sherman stays on there, a team can still be good for the next 2 or 3 years. He leaves the team, there's no guarantee that the team can be as reliable because Earl Thomas also threw out the possibility that he retires. And if that's the case, if he retires and Richard Sherman's gone, I love you, Cam Chancellor. You're not going to be able to do that all by yourself. But with that said, we're going to get out of here. You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. You can listen to us on a bunch of different outlets. You can go Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iTunes, anything that you can think of. Listen to it through your radio, whatever you want to do. The little radio app on your phone. If you want to follow us online, throw us a Fantasy Football Podcast on Facebook, Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football. You want to follow us on Twitter, at GSMC_F Football. I've been Anthony. You guys have a great weekend, and Jeremiah will talk to you again on Tuesday. Goodbye.